with one of the most fundamental questions of our time, the West's last chance. Can we win the war, the clash of civilizations? This is the title of Mr. Blankley's recently published book, a central question. Most of you know Mr. Blankley one way or another. He, as you well know, was with, well, actually he was a speechwriter with Mr. Ronald Reagan, of course. And he served as the press secretary for Newt Gingrich for 7 years. His journalistic career began, I believe, with George Magazine, John F. Kennedy Jr.'s venture as a columnist. He's been a syndicated columnist with the Los Angeles Times Syndicate. He joined the Washington Times in 1999. Many of you know him from the McLaughlin Group, where he's a regular member. You've seen him interviewed on numerous of the major talk interview shows, and since 2002, he's been editorial page editor at the Washington Times. He's here tonight in connection with the underlying questions that he's addressed in his book. The question of the nature and the extent of the jihad and extreme Islam today is a question of just enormous importance, and one that probably puzzles us. And to try to get close to the truth about the problem and then to reflect upon some of the solutions is a great challenge to our country today. And we're absolutely delighted that Mr. Blankley, who's given these questions considerable thought and has written very, very nicely about them. It was good of him to join us. It's my pleasure to present to you Mr. Tony Blankley. Mr. Blankley.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here tonight. It's an odd thing for me to find myself something in the role of a Jeremiah, wandering out of the desert as a prophet of doom. It's not my style. My life has been one of sort of being sensible and not getting too excited about anything. Most of the organizations and politicians I've worked for, I would say I was always the one who said, well, let's not worry too much, don't get too excited, let's just sort of walk forward a step or two. And I was mentioning before these remarks that my dad, when I was I guess a teenager, had advised me once that things are rarely as good or as bad as they seem. And I always found that to be good advice. Don't get too excited about the good times because it's not that good, and no matter how bad it looks, you probably work your way through. We were English, and muddling through is sort of runs in my veins. And so it is not a natural act to have written a book which is, I think, fairly characterized as an alarmist book, and to now be wandering around the country on radio and TV and in person, laying out my assessment of the danger. As I point out in the book, I am not an Islamic scholar. I am not an anti-terrorism or intelligence expert. I don't pretend to be. I was a prosecutor in LA for 8 years before I came back here. I'd been in politics as a campaign operative for many years before that, and I've been basically a politician. I was in Reagan's White House for 6 years as a speechwriter and some other odd jobs. I was sort of a utility infielder. And then, of course, 7 years with Newt. So I've dealt with major national policy issues, in policy formulation and communication. That's been basically what I've done the last quarter century. And then in these last now 10 years as an editorial commentator, opinion journalist. I'm not really a reporter. I've never been a reporter, and I don't feel like I'm a journalist. I'm kind of an opinion monger. And what I have done on this is approach the issue as I would have if I was on the president's staff or on the speaker's staff, trying to assess what's the nature of the danger and how do we deal with it. And of course, that's the way largely policies are going to get made in a democracy. The specialists, and I'm sure there are many specialists and subspecialists in the room tonight, know a vast amount about individual topics, and they give their advice up, and then the politicians, and then eventually the public, ratifying or not ratifying the politicians, make the policy judgments, and we move forward or backward based on those judgments. So this is a book written by a generalist, a politician essentially, trying to look at the issue. Like everybody else, or almost everybody else, I was shocked on the morning of September 11th. We live in Great Falls, Virginia, about 6 miles from Langley, CIA headquarters. And I was shocked when I saw what was going on the television. And then I got a call from a friend of the National Security Council to tell me that a good friend of mine, Barbara Olson, who some of you may know had been a pundit on TV. She'd worked on the Hill closely with me, had been in the plane that went into the Pentagon that morning. And I was just sort of standing in my horse field petting one of my pony's noses and looking vacantly off into space. And one of the itinerant thoughts that crossed through my mind at that point was, I wonder which way the wind blows between my house and CIA headquarters, because obviously CIA headquarters could be a target. And that very practical, if slightly excited, thought crossed my mind. And then I had this brief relief that the wind blows from west to east, and the CIA is downwind of my little farm, because I was looking at the field, and I think of my children, and wondering, is this really as safe a place as I thought I had managed to construct for my little family? And one of the problems with politics generally, and experts particularly sometimes, is we tend to abstract, we tend to theorize, and we tend not to think through how policies actually affect flesh and blood people. But that more, and I'm as guilty as anyone else. I mean, I've been an ideologue and a political debater, and you get wrapped up in the theories that you've developed over your lifetime, and you try to squeeze facts in to fit your theories because you're stuck with the theories that you've got, you know. And that morning I was not thinking like a traditional Washington theoretician or abstractor. I was thinking very physically and concretely. And I decided I was going to try to figure out what was happening. I mean, I write a column every week. I'm an editor of the newspaper. I'm on TV talking, so it made vocational sense to try to figure out what was going on. And I had a deep interest in trying to understand it, because the world I knew had shifted in ways that I didn't understand the dimensions of. And so what I started doing was just calling old friends contacts I'd made basically in the intelligence community over my years in the White House and my years with Speaker Gingrich. I wasn't asking for classified information, and they wouldn't have given it to me. I just wanted to take their temperature. How bad is it? Is the bureaucracy functioning? Are we dysfunctional? Where are we? And what I found, basically I was just talking with people and reading books and calling experts over the next 3 years and writing columns as I felt I had some little insight to add to the discussion. And I found that I'd become an alarmist. And what I found was that the men and women, particularly the mid-level counterintelligence people who I'd be talking with, were deeply alarmed, somewhere between fatalistic and working very hard to try to manage this seemingly unmanageable world that we found ourselves in. And then when I talked to congressmen, Hill staffers, journalists, people who didn't have line responsibilities and line knowledge about the challenge, people seemed to be less concerned. So I felt that maybe my alarmism was justified. I'd never written a book before. I had a number of publishers call me up from time to time because would I write a book for them because I sort of fit the profile. I'm on TV and I write, so they figure you can sort of conjure up some useful title and manufacture a little book, and everybody can make a few bucks. And I didn't find that appealing. I had a busy, happy life, and I didn't want to squeeze a book into that just for the sake of writing it. But I did a column last November commenting on Theo van Gogh's assassination in Holland. I'm sure most of you remember that. He is a distant ancestor of Vincent van Gogh, or Van Gogh, as you might well. I'm never sure what the right one is. I always think that Van Gogh sounds like I'm more educated, but I'm not sure. So I had got on the internet when the assassination happened, and I was looking at European media reaction to it, and I was struck by how dramatic the reaction was. Der Spiegel, I mean, all across Europe, there was a furious amount of commentary on it, as I had not seen after the murders in Beslan, even after the attack in Madrid. Certainly not after the attack in Bali or elsewhere. And so I wrote a column saying if perhaps 2005 is going to be the turnaround year for Europe, where Europeans finally begin to take seriously this danger. And the Regnery Publishing, who had called me a couple of times before to ask whether I'd write a book, called me up again and said, gee, that was a great column, Tony, would you like to expand that into a book? And I said yes. I didn't get an agent. I just went down and we chatted briefly. We signed a 3-book deal. I don't know whether I got a good advance or not, but it was fine. And I went about the business of trying to pull together everything I'd been reading and thinking and talking with people about over the previous 3 years to write this book. So that's how I got to the point of writing it. I wanted to keep it under 200 pages because I wanted a lot of people to read it. And I know that it's amazing how few people read books, and if you write a 400-page book, almost nobody will read it unless you're an extraordinarily big name. And a lot of people buy those books, but they don't always read them. And so I came in at 198 pages of text. So I hit my mark on that regard. My approach to the book, and my son, my oldest son, who's second year at Princeton, and he gave me a book review after he read my book. I didn't show it to anybody until I got it published, and he thought it was pretty good. He thought it was a little disconnected. He said it looks like it's really like 8 separate books. You didn't really integrate as well as you might have the different sections, which is exactly, by the way, the problem. I knew it as I was writing it, that I was basically trying to deal with a broad range of issues that related to this, and I really didn't quite know how to fully integrate it seamlessly. I wanted to look, first of all, at what the threat was. What's the nature and dimension of the danger we face? I wanted to take an assessment of how Europe was responding to the threat as they saw it, as Europeans saw it. Now, European is a general word. Obviously, there's different reaction in different countries. But I wanted to focus on Europe because Europe is our historic ally, and it is obviously the font of Western civilization. And we've struggled with our European cousins to fight off fascism in the past and to a large extent communism during the Cold War, although we had Europe as an ideological battleground and a potential military battleground through that period. So I wanted to first look at what is the threat, what are the Europeans reacting to this, how have we fought wars in the past? And I did a chapter on defending democracy 1940 style under Roosevelt, not because the two wars are similar. They're the two most dissimilar operational wars one could imagine. World War II obviously was millions of men in arms, organized formations marching across borders, thousands of tanks and planes. This is largely a struggle of information withheld and information sought, of dangerous weapons clandestinely moved. And episodically, there would be conventional fighting, as in Iraq, as in Afghanistan, perhaps in the future in the Horn of Africa, doubtlessly other places. But the nature of the operationally of the war is very different. But the question of the mentality of how we went about defending ourselves when we thought we were in an existential threat, I think is similar to the existential threat I think we're in now. So I did a chapter on civil liberties and sense of urgency during World War II and compared it to what we're doing or not doing today. I tried to look into, since I think that we aren't, both Americans and Europeans, have not come to grips with the danger. I tried to do a little history of how it is that we've managed to get ourselves to think in a way that we don't seem to be instinctively prepared to defend our civilization. And we seem to be confused and not being able to marshal all of the vast resources that the West has to defend itself. So a little bit of a history. I talk about political correctness, not as an ideological point. This is not a conservatives book attacking liberals. I mean, if there's a hero in this book, it's FDR. And in fact, somebody wrote that shortly after the book came out, you know, Tony, you've written the most withering criticism of George Bush's leadership in the war on terror. And although I'm a supporter of his, I have been, I knew him when he was the vice president's son. I wrote the editorial endorsing him for president last year. I don't agree with all his policies, but I'm obviously a strong supporter. I'm on TV every week, usually defending him. But it's true that, in fact, I think I've probably written a fairly withering criticism of George Bush. So this is not an ideological book. It's not a Republican versus Democrat, a liberal versus conservative book. What I've attempted to do is put my ideology at the doorstep and simply look at the facts and go wherever those facts have taken me. And they've taken me in some degrees in the last chapter where I talk about solutions in places that I don't like to be. Because, for instance, I'm a civil libertarian. I came out of the libertarian wing of the Reagan Revolution. As a prosecutor, I've always understood the great capacity that the government has to abuse its police powers. I've seen it done by policemen, seen it done by other prosecutors. I don't think I ever did. But I understand that danger, so I don't like government power, and yet I want to give our government a lot more power than it currently has. So I put my ideology aside. Let me just briefly discuss the basic points in my book, and then elaborate a little bit, and then take questions until, I guess, 7:10, which apparently is the witching hour here. My central thesis is that the war on terror is not just about bin Laden and al-Qaeda and Islamist terrorists, although that's a huge problem that despite all the effort we haven't got our hands around yet. And if that were the only problem, I would still be an alarmist. But that's only, in my judgment, a symptom of the greater challenge. And what I believe it is, and I have a little discussion of the history of how Islam has developed over the last 70 years. And by the way, I refer to experts, but I picked no neoconservative experts. I picked French scholars on Islam. I don't want anyone to accuse me of cherry-picking my experts to find people who are predisposed to support my arguments. And I think that my description is objectively valid. I had a debate a couple of weeks ago at the National Press Club with, I'm terrible on names, which is why I have very few names in this book. When I see lots of names in books, I start skipping over them, even if they're English names, and if they're foreign names, I'm hopeless. So Professor Ahmed, I believe, he's the head of the Middle East Department at American University. He was a former Pakistani High Commissioner to Britain. He did a BBC series on explaining Islam to the West, I guess about 10 or 15 years ago. He's an eminent scholar, and he and I have become friends over the last 3 or 4 years, although we disagree on a lot of things. And we had a debate at the press club. And what I found out was, and I say this only as sort of endorse half of my book, which is he agreed with my general assessment of the danger and the threat and the development of Islamic thought. He and I disagree on the cures. And there may very well be in this audience people who are vastly more familiar with the history of developments that started with largely the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928 in Egypt. But in a nutshell, I believe that Islam is now in ferment in a way that it hasn't been in centuries. And it was part of, I think, the post-colonial world, that peoples around the world, as European colonialism receded, were seeking dignity and sovereignty in their own lands, which was all to the good. And we've seen those struggles across the planet in the last half century. And Islam was one of those processes. Unfortunately, it got infested, I believe, with the idea that terrorism is a uniquely useful device for advancing their perception of their interest. And there's a particular author, Sahib Qutb, Q-U-T-B, and I'm mispronouncing his name. I asked the Egyptian ambassador how to pronounce it. He said, don't worry, it cannot be pronounced in English properly. But he was an Egyptian intellectual in the 40s. He came to America and found everything here he hated. He said he was, attempted to be seduced by a drunken Christian woman. We were racist. Our churches were sexual playgrounds. He also deduced somehow that George Washington had been in Central America killing Indian peasants. But nonetheless, he wrote a book about what he found in America, and it is bathed in a loathing of American and Western culture. And bin Laden is one of his acolytes. He is sort of the seminal author on terrorism, for Islamic terrorism. And for a long time, it was only intellectuals in little terrorist cells and bands who bought into this. And while there was still, obviously, as anyone knows about the history of the Middle East of the last half century, obviously a lot of energy building because the condition is lousy and things have been coming to a head. And then about 10, 15 years ago, we started seeing these radical ideas gaining some currency amongst the grassroots of Islam, not uniformly, but beyond trace elements. And I make a big point repeatedly in this book that I'm not getting into a debate about the nature of Islam. First of all, because I'm not a scholar and don't know. I've read the Quran a few times. I've read the Bible many times. I'm certainly not a biblical scholar. And I'm dubious of whether any religion has one true meaning. Every religion I'm familiar with, there are people on 2 or 3 or 7 sides who each claim that their version of their religion is the one true meaning. So there's big debate about is Islam a religion of peace or not? I'll leave for others. This is a secular book trying to figure out what individuals think and do and are planning to do. And what is evident is that increasing numbers of Muslims think, whether correctly or incorrectly, whether correctly interpreting the Quran or incorrectly interpreting, that the radical ideology describes to them what they ought to be doing, which includes terrorism. And that's an empirical fact. It's not a judgment about a religion. Now, the numbers outside of the Middle East, the numbers are increasingly disturbing. Now, trying to figure out what percentage have been radicalized is to some extent a fool's errand. It's a snapshot in time. These are numbers that are going to be going up and down. It's a dynamic process, of course. But the Guardian newspaper in Britain last year, which is, I'm sure most of you know, is the leading liberal paper in Britain, very hostile to Tony Blair and George Bush's foreign policies, did a poll of the 1.5 to 2 million British Muslims. And they published it last November. And they found that a little bit more than 10% of the 1.5 to 2 million British Muslims supported the idea of committing terrorism against the British government. That another 30% would never do such a thing, but would also never cooperate with authorities in turning in a co-religionist who was suspected of either planning or having committed terrorism. And 60% would prefer to live under Sharia law, that is, traditional Muslim law, rather than British law. Now, that poll may not be accurate. Cut the numbers in half, cut them in third. It gives one some indication that significant elements, percentages, are now having a couple of different attitudes. Not only the terrorist attitude, but the cultural attitude of not wanting to integrate, which I believe is something we've seen in France, and we can get into that. I should say that in my book, which I finished writing in late April of this year, came out September 11th, I anticipated an Islamist terrorist attack in London. I anticipated that European museums would withdraw artwork that was offensive to Muslim sensibilities, and that there would be urban Muslim violence in Europe. And the first city I mentioned was Paris. And I don't believe I'm clairvoyant at all. I believe that anyone who took a look at the facts would draw these fairly obvious conclusions. By the way, the Tate Gallery, one of the great museums of the world, based in London, a few months after I wrote the book, announced that they were withdrawing an art exhibit because it was offensive to Muslim sensibilities. So the greater danger is that the Muslim population, to the extent that it is getting radicalized, is doing two things. One, it's hostile to the host culture, and two, it's a safe haven for the actual terrorists, whatever numbers they may be. By the way, MI5 announced about 2 months ago that the danger, shortly after the July terrorist attack on the London tubes and bus, that the danger facing Britain was not merely terrorist cells, but an insurgency. They used the word insurgency, describing not Iraq, but Britain. So, which I think is consistent with my understanding of the emerging danger. And particularly, I think there's a connection. I actually quote Michael Shearer, the author of Imperial Hubris, who wrote a book that many of you may have read or remembered last year. It was a tremendous attack on George Bush, but that was only half of the book. The other half of the book was describing the nature of the danger. He'd run the bin Laden unit at CIA for a number of years, so he's not just a guy walking off the street. I published a number of his op-eds this year. I asked him about the media coverage of his book. I said, you know, I've read your book, and I don't agree with everything, but I'm stunned with how much I agree with regarding your characterization of the nature of the danger that we're facing, and I don't remember seeing that in the media. And he said, well, no. All they wanted to know, they would only quote those sections that attacked George Bush. It was an election year. And he said the other half of my book they completely ignored. When I tried to get into that, they just didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to, you know, so, but nonetheless, the author, and I quote him in the book, he made the observation, which I had just kind of wondered about, and he wrote about it in his book, that there is some relationship between the rise of the internet and the rise of radical Islam's communication to a broader population than it otherwise might reach. And, you know, I think many, know that, a lot of people believe that Protestantism would not have been possible without the printing press. The Protestant requires a direct relationship with his Bible or her Bible, which was not practical unless you could print hundreds of thousands or millions of Bibles. So until the printing press came along, you didn't have a practical way to get a Bible at least to every small village, if not to every home. Once the printing press came along, Protestantism came along and rose, spread, as you know, of course, through Europe. And we did, by the way, have horrible religious wars for a while after that. And the rise of the internet is, to me, not to me, but I quote various messages on the radical Islamic internets in translation. I did not do the translation because I don't read Arabic, but the translations are done by leading French experts, scholars, that they are a wonderful device for reaching the young Muslim men in Europe, second and third generation, who are disconnected from their homelands, disconnected from traditional values and the traditional teachings of their religion, and are, as all young people are, we're always looking for the purpose in life. They're isolated, as we've seen, from the cultures, in the host cultures in Europe. As you know, one of the men who did September 11th was based in Hamburg. And they're reading on the internet these implorations to go on jihad, and I quote some of them. In fact, I quoted one particular cleric who was out calling for jihad in Britain, and I said, why in the world haven't the British arrested this man and deported him for sedition, and he's not a citizen? And interestingly, after the July attack in London, the Blair administration did arrest this man and is in the process, or was in the process, of deporting him. I had cited the British Code section to that and was puzzled as to why they weren't doing anything. Well, they're doing it now. One of the things that's happening on the internet is a distortion of traditional Islamic teachings on a key issue, which is how does a young Muslim man decide whether to go on a jihad or not? And I quote Olivier Roy, who is the leading Islamic scholar at Sciences Po in France, which is the premier French university for aspiring prime ministers and presidents. I think all of the last X number have gone there. He's an acknowledged expert. And he says this is, and I quote his paragraph, because this is such a controversial point, I didn't want to assert it myself, that this is a genuine example, and bin Laden is one of the few things bin Laden has specifically written on, that the jihad should be considered an individual decision for a Muslim man. Now, by traditional Islamic teaching, an individual can't make the decision to go on jihad. That's a decision for the legal elders of the community, and it's a wise policy. Obviously, you don't want to have any hothead on the street be able to rally a bunch of young men and start acting on the name of your religion and your community without senior cooler heads making the judgment that a jihad is justified. And so they've you could call this a heresy if you wanted to have a religious view. They are, and I quote sections where they're telling these young men as they're sitting in their apartments, come and jihad with me, you have a decision to make yourself. You know, traditionally the only decisions that a Muslim has to have an individual responsibility are his 5 responsibilities of prayer and charity and pilgrimage and the others. They've now added jihad to one that you don't need any advice for, and we've seen the rise of this. So the danger is then that the contagion is spreading. We don't know at what rate. We don't know whether it will expand further or contract, although all the experts I talked with and all the experts I read believe, whether it's the head of German security or most of the scholars, other academics in Europe who are teaching some of these at the top universities in France who are teaching these young men who are not poor, they're going to the best French colleges, believe that the trend is towards more radicalization. The trend is not towards tamping it down yet. And so that is the greater danger. There's a big struggle going on theoretically in European Islam between those who think you should integrate into your host culture, that would be a sort of a traditional view, those who think that they should isolate themselves, not be contaminated, but do nothing else, and those who think they have a cultural obligation to change the host culture. And those people are arguing that Europe, which Islam traditionally considers to be the land of neutrality, where a Muslim should live his life in accordance with his religion but not try to convert the infidel, should be considered the land of war, where they do have that obligation. And I quote some polling showing changing attitudes with the shift from 40% believing in integration to a year later 30% believing in integration, and seeing the movement percentage who believe it should be a land of war moving, I don't know the numbers right to head, but from mid-teens to the mid-20s, so that you can see the movement happening more towards cultural aggression, as well as the worst element, which of course is the terror act itself. Now, this would be bad enough, I would think, but we happen to live, coincidentally, at the first moment in human history when weapons of mass destruction are plausibly available to any large determined group of people who want to get them. And this adds a whole magnitude of danger to the world we find ourselves in. That's not my opinion. Head of Interpol said that he believes that a biological Islamist terrorist attack is a real danger to Europe and the United States, and neither of us are prepared. Senator Lugar, Chairman Lugar of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, impaneled 80 of the world's leading experts on weapons of mass destruction earlier this year, not government employees, but from around the world. Their consensus judgment was that there is a 70% chance that we will get hit by an Islamist terrorist with a weapon of mass destruction, more likely biological or chemical or radiological, that is a dirty bomb, less likely nuclear, in the next 10 years. Portagas, testifying before Congress, similarly believes that it's only a matter of time before we get hit by such a weapon. What I find, it's hard to find a leading expert, not just in America but in Europe, who doesn't think that it's a when, not an if question. Now, what surprises me, having been in law enforcement and been in local politics before I got into national, normally law enforcement officials, government officials downplay these terrifying announcements, whether it's because they don't want to panic the public. So they usually say, if there's a rapist on the loose, there's always attempt to minimize so as not to create panic. Well, here you've got the world's leading experts making these flamboyant statements of inevitable danger, getting minimal media coverage. I mean, I had to find the head of Interpol statement on a CNN Saturday broadcast. It was a brief little statement. I mean, I assume it appeared somewhere else, but someone had told me, oh, the head of Interpol had made that statement. You should check it out. And I was, looking for it, and I couldn't find it, and finally tracked it down on a Saturday afternoon CNN story. So the experts tell us this, and all I'm doing is reporting the overwhelming consensus judgment of the world's leading experts, not just American experts, that this is a danger. When you combine the growing radicalization of the population with the likelihood that they're going to come into possession. By the way, the Council on Foreign Relations, the other one, published a statement that they believe that in 2002, Al-Qaeda came into possession of a radiological device. That's Council on Foreign Relations, which is hardly a band of hotheads or neocon nests. As you know who they are, they're the most reliable establishment people in journalism and government on foreign policy. So when you see all of these different people making these flat-out statements, and then you see the increasing numbers of people who are buying into the actual violence and the larger numbers who are culturally assertive and will give protection to their co-religionists, I think we have an unprecedented danger in the world. And that is the burden of my warning. I try to elaborate it. Now, I also discuss population trends in Europe using UN numbers. It's sort of a side issue a little bit, but it's worth observing, at least, that if current birth rates continue, and they don't have to, and I quote some of the leading demographers in the world saying they don't know why birth rates go up or down. And by the way, there's some evidence that European women want to have more children than they're currently having. There was a survey of 40,000 German women who said overwhelmingly that they wanted to have more children than they had, but they felt social pressure not to. So if Europe changed its attitudes towards having larger families, you might see a very dramatic shift in the birth rates. And it's also the case that even Muslim birth rates, not everywhere, Saudi Arabia, some countries are still very high, but both in Europe and in the traditional lands of Islam are coming down from the high levels they were at. We're seeing that in the third world generally, that you're seeing the 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 rates of fertility coming down to sort of 3.5. So the numbers are changing a little bit, but if the current trends continue, currently there are 700 million indigenous Europeans living in the whole continent of Europe, and about 20 million Muslims. At the end of this century, according to the United Nations demographic data, the 700 million would be down to 200 million, and there would be a majority of Muslims living in Europe. Now, that doesn't say anything about their ideology. It doesn't say that they'd be traditional or radical. Who can know 95 years from now where those ideas would be? But it would change the culture, obviously, of that continent, the font of Western civilization. Let me just very briefly, because I know we lose time very quickly at these events, but I'm prepared to expose my breast to your withering questions in just a moment. And I promise to give you appallingly honest answers. But let me just briefly say my last chapter is what should we do about it? And I don't begin to claim to have the formula for eventually winning, but some initial points that I think make sense. The first is I would have a congressional declaration of war against radical Islam, which sounds nuts, and I take your point implicitly. First of all, there's no provision for that, because we only declare war on countries, and I understand that the people, the forces that we would be declaring war on could very well be living in London or Paris or Washington or friendly countries. But the fact is that until this moment in history, no threat was great enough to give an executive branch of the U.S. government war powers unless it was coming from a territorial country, a Germany, a Japan, or whatever it was. But now we have a danger which is as great as that which we historically faced from a great nation that was hostile to us, coming from what the military specialists call non-state actors, that is, terrorists who don't control a country but have extraordinary powers of destruction. And I think we need to have wartime powers for our government because I believe the danger is so great. But being a constitutionalist, I don't want to do it illegally. So I think the law has traditionally responded to changing circumstances. There used to be no law to deal with corporations until businessmen in the 19th century figured out that corporations were a useful economic device, limited liability, equity participation. And the law then brilliantly crafted means of regulating this new phenomena because the law adapts. As Oliver Wendell Holmes said, the history of the law is not logic but experience. So as new facts arise, the law has to adapt. We have a new fact. We have a new fact of non-state actors bearing weapons of mass destruction, capable of killing millions of Americans, and we need to have the presidential powers to deal with that as if it were a traditional war. So I think we need to have a constitutional declaration of war. I also think we need to name the enemy. It's not Islam, it's radical. And I don't care about the precise words, whether it's radical Islam, Islamist. And by the way, this phenomena is so new of radical Islam. I list in the book all the different terminology that the various experts are using. Is it fundamentalist, neo-fundamentalist, Salafist, Islamist? You know that when the experts can't even agree on the terminology, we're the fairly early stages of a phenomena. And but we do need to name the nature of the danger, which is, whichever words you want to use, radicalism. One of the problems I think President Bush has had is by saying it's just a war on terror. Well, it's not just a war. It's not against the IRA. It's not against the Tamil terrorists. It's against a specific threat, which is radical Islamist terrorists. And if you can't talk about it, then you can't lead a country, because we need to have, whether it's this president or the next one, whoever he or she is going to be, we need to have presidents like Churchill or Roosevelt who can talk to the people, not with great oratory, or that would be nice, but simply straightforwardly and explain what is the danger, why are we doing these things. If you can't talk about the danger in honest terms, then we can't have a democratic process. And for democracy, having the public support behind an effort is a strategic element of any struggle. Maybe dictatorships can for a while sustain a struggle without the popular support, although even dictatorships eventually worry about popular support. Hitler was afraid to send German women into the factories, because he was worried that it would upset the German people. So even absolute dictators have to worry a little bit about public opinion. And certainly in a democracy, we have to worry a lot, and we should worry a lot about public opinion. So I think naming the nature of it. Now, people say, well, that'll just encourage people who are otherwise not radicalized to be radicalized, because they're going to think that we're going after everybody, and we're not. I think there's some value to that argument. I think there was more value before we went into Afghanistan and Iraq than there is now. By having invaded and occupied 2 Muslim countries in 2 years, we probably offended a good percentage of the people who are likely to be offended by us for our actions. And so as a result, in fact, by naming the name radical, or pick your term, we are narrowing the focus of our enemies. Then combined with what I think will be sort of a long Cold War kind of struggle to strengthen the voices of respectable and moderate Islam, just as we supported the voices of democracy and capitalism versus communism for half a century. We did it by every mean from, as I'm sure some people in this room know and maybe participated in, everything from coups to supporting journalists who were friendly, to do every possible means to try to strengthen the voices that will oppose radical Islam and try to negate the voices that are encouraging it. So that's a long twilight struggle that we have to, because ultimately this danger will begin to fade away when the fever and the ideology no longer can gain currency amongst the fifth of mankind, over 1 billion human souls, which is the world's Islam. So the final solution to defeating this evil is within Islam, and we have a big role to play in trying to assist the peaceful voices. But in the interim, and this is where I disagree with Professor Ahmed, I don't think that that's enough. I think we have to be extraordinarily vigilant in the short term to try to do everything we can to protect ourselves from the danger of terrorist attack. Now, I think we obviously, I'm not going to have a long discussion, we need to secure the borders. One zone where I differ from my own philosophy is I think we need biometric national ID cards. Now, as I say, I come from the libertarian wing of the Republican Party, and which sounds an odd thing for me to say, and I've been going on conservative talk radio shows around the country, and they're all kind of nodding their head figuratively with me until I get to that, and they say, well, wait a second, Tony, I don't much care for biometric ID cards, and I don't either. But at this moment in time, because this is largely a struggle of information, I'm more scared of our not knowing who people are when we're checking them, whether at airports, whether they're getting a job at chemical or nuclear plants, whether they're applying for jobs with the government or anywhere else. I'm more scared of the danger of coming from terrorists getting in the wrong place at the wrong time than I am from the government, much as I am worried about the government. By the way, my argument on the declaration of war, which would give those wartime powers, is that it should be sunset reset it every 2 years. To me, that's the protection we need. So each new Congress would have to re-vote the war powers. So if the public thought that the president, whoever it was, had abused the powers, they would be extinguished at the end of each 2 years, each Congress, and a new power wouldn't be voted on if the public didn't want it, because you know how hard it is to pass anything in Congress. I think ethnic profiling is, where useful, something that should be authorized. By the way, Tony Blair, the head of the Metropolitan Police in London now, are using ethnic profiling, not because it's perfect. It's not. Not everybody is going to be identifiable, but to the extent that our security services believe it is a device that can be useful, it's irrational not to use it. I make one final closing point, and then we'll do Q&A. We've got to think through these issues, particularly issues of civil liberties, issues of discrimination, if you will, on the basis of ethnicity or religion, which is abhorrent instinctively in America and should be, through the prism of national security. I think that this reason why Earl Warren, when he was Attorney General of California, was in favor of internment, which I'm not in favor, I'm just saying, and the Supreme Court upheld internment based on whether if you were an Italian or German or Japanese, in the case of the Japanese, even citizens. And if you read the Supreme Court opinion that said it's constitutional, the argument was precisely that it is only human nature to assume that anyone who is ethnically connected to the enemy has a slightly higher likelihood of being disloyal. And therefore, we have a right, this is what they said in World War II, to incarcerate, which we did, Romanians, Italians, Germans, Japanese, any ethnic nationals of the belligerent powers we were fighting, to put them into internment camps for the duration, without any access to the American court system to challenge it and without any evidence of individual culpability. And the Supreme Court said that was legal at time of war, and Earl Warren called for it. Now, I'm only talking about this regarding ethnic profiling, which is the same concept. And I would point out that 9 years later, the man who led the Supreme Court to the end of segregation in the public schools in Brown v. Board of Education was the same man, Earl Warren, who in 1942 was calling for discrimination on the basis of ethnicity. And I don't think the man changed. I think he was looking through a different prism. When he was looking through the prism of fear that there might be danger to the country, he said it's justified. When he was looking through the prism of in domestic circumstances, there's no justification for discrimination. So the same man, within a decade, called for two radically different approaches to what ought to be considered legal. I think we need to think through the prism of national security and national danger in making the judgments about what kind of intrusions into civil liberties we can be justified in doing. Justice Learned Hand, the greatest justice not to make it to the Supreme Court, characterizing this issue, said that the magnitude of the threat discounted by the unlikeliness of its occurring should determine the level of intrusion into civil liberties. That statement was then endorsed by the Supreme Court. I think that's a useful formula. Now, different people will make their judgment of how to balance that differently. I've given mine. It doesn't matter what I think. But what I do care about is people addressing the issue through that measurement, and then we'll find out what a national consensus is on how we balance that formula. But if we're not even using that formula, I don't think we're in a process that can get to a rational point. I could chatter on a lot more, but I've talked too long. Let me start taking questions. Thank you very much.
Mr. Blankley will field the questions and repeat them, but please do ask a question, and as succinctly as possible.
The question is, I didn't address the question of the Arab-Israeli dispute and its effect, as various other Arab speakers here have said, on attitudes in Islam, and what do I think would be the utility of doing that if it would result in the creation of a Palestinian state. I hope I basically got it right. I do deal with it in the book. And this is an example where I think neither side in the great debate is being entirely honest. Because you've got President Bush saying that the reason why they're against us and they're attacking us is because they hate the way we live. They hate our lifestyle. Then you've got the Pat Buchanans and many others, and Pat's a good friend of mine who I disagree with most of the time these days, who say that it's our foreign policy. And Michael Shearer of Imperial Hubris makes the same arguments. It's our foreign policy. If we weren't supporting corrupt Muslim leaders in Saudi Arabia and Egypt and elsewhere, if we weren't supporting Israel, that's what bin Laden is targeted at. That's what's arousing Muslim anger around the world. And if we simply withdrew from those, in other words, if we appeased that foreign policy, they don't use the word, but if we appeased the foreign policy demands, that we would avoid the danger. And I think there's some truth in both of those arguments. As I said, I think if you look at the founding document of radicalism, you see that there is a loathing of our culture. And in fact, you see, for instance, in Britain, the desecration of billboards because they do things that are offensive culturally to radicalized Muslims. And the last 50 years can't be forgotten by any part of the world. So if we were starting over again in 1946, it would be a more compelling argument. If we just didn't get involved in the Middle East, maybe many of these attitudes wouldn't exist. And I do not doubt for a second that the continuing Arab-Israeli struggle is exacerbating and giving daily opportunities for the radicals to gain recruits amongst Muslim people. So I think both pieces explain it. Now, I'm not prepared to appease that foreign policy. I'm not prepared to give up the Middle East oil, and I'm not prepared either morally or strategically to give up Israel. But I think we have to recognize that that's exacerbating it. I certainly agree that if we can get an agreement, I mean, who can't possibly want to have an agreement between the Palestinians and Israelis? If it, and Editorial, I support every initiative that comes down the pike. I have my doubts as to whether we're going to gain that peace anytime soon, but of course that would be a huge step forward if we could resolve it. I mean, I think you'd have to be a madman not to want to see an accord, but an awful lot of very able statesmen have broken their pick trying to work that out. The question is, is there someone for the Israelis to negotiate with who is capable of delivering an enforceable agreement? We'll see whether Mr. Abbas is able to do that. I don't want to get into a long discussion of the details there, but we all know the history of it. It's extraordinarily difficult. It probably would have been easier 30 years ago than it is now, because there's 30 more years of angry history on all sides. And you're seeing the Israeli government in turmoil. I mean, the Likud party is being thrown over by its creator. You've got Perez joining Sharon. Who would have dreamed of that? Which I think is a good indication, just it's off topic, but it means that there's probably going to be a strong government interested in negotiating peace and willing to make some substantial deals for it, unencumbered by the fanatical religious parties in Israel that make it hard for the Likud party leaders to make a negotiation. So in a medium short answer, that's the answer. Next question. The gentleman has in khaki, as we used to say, or Cami, I guess these days, has a professional responsibility in biochem warfare, and what would I have his chain of command do to do a better job? I'm going to disappoint you because I have no expertise in that area, and I'm not going to try to pretend and fake some technical knowledge that I don't have. I want to leave up to our experts the zones where experts are best able to perform. What I want to do is, what I think is a political and a general question is, how much power should we give to the government to be searching and to be inquiring? We can't even get the Patriot Act to be reauthorized without it being watered down by Republicans in the House of Representatives right now. We are so far away from trying to strengthen our intelligence capacities, domestic intelligence capacities, that we're going in the wrong direction from 3 years ago. But as far as the technical levels, I've got to leave that to people who would understand the issues. I don't pretend to. Yes, sir. The question is, now that the British are beginning to get rid of what the gentleman said with their undesirables, and the French are beginning to get tough on that, will that make it easier for us to have a national ID card here in the United States? My general theory on what it'll take to get America to take it more seriously is I deeply hope that warnings such as mine and many others will be sufficient, and events outside of America will be sufficient to turn the politics around. But in my heart, I suspect that it'll only be another attack that will trigger galvanized action to protect ourselves more vigorously than we currently are. But certainly to the extent that the French and the British and maybe the Germans in a while start taking these actions, it'll make it easier to advocate it here in America. But right now the politics is so divisive. And by the way, to return briefly to the Iraq question, and I talk about this briefly in the book, whatever one thinks about the Iraq war, and you know what I think, I was for it, I remain for it, it has been such an extraordinary distraction from the broader war on terror. Part of that is everyone's to blame. President Bush has a piece of the blame when he says that Iraq is the main front of the war on terror. There's a technical way in which that's a correct statement. That's where all the physical action is going on. But it distorts the nature. A lot of people think the war on terror is Iraq. Iraq is one small front. It's like the Sicily campaign in World War II. And to the extent that people are identifying the war on terror with Iraq, and then, of course, polarized around their opposition to Iraq, they're not open to looking at the much broader question of this worldwide war on Islamist terror. So Iraq, if I had known that it was going to be such an extraordinary distraction, I would have added that piece to the debit side of the decision of whether to go into Iraq. And I think, by the way, that President Bush has pretty badly mismanaged the communication. I've said that publicly. I've told his people, most of whom are my friends, privately. I think it's been a stunningly incompetent job of White House communications. For instance, just one quick example, and I was asking this to a very senior political staffer in the White House last week over lunch at the Hay Adams. I said, where is your surrogate campaign from senior Republican foreign policy types? Republicans have a very deep bench of respected figures coming from all the administrations going at least back to Nixon. Republicans have a much deeper bench than the Democrats do on foreign policy. I used to organize surrogate campaigns. Why don't we see these very distinguished men and some women who can carry a message, have credibility with the mainline media, cannot be ignored, in a systematic way of describing in a positive way the president's policies? And they haven't done it. I mean that's sort of simple. I mean, you don't need to even be a bright communications guy to have come up with that. They haven't done it. So I am stunned by their failure to communicate, and I think part of the problem with the division we have in the country, along with obviously the partisanship on the other side, but has been the ineptitude of the White House's communication operation.
I think this has been an extraordinary evening, Mr. Blankley. We thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.